America, the land of the free. Over the last 239 years, the patriotic ideals of this country have spread to include everyone, including women, people of color, LGBT Americans, and young citizens. Since the dawn of time, and especially since the founding of these United States, youth have been involved in politics and related movements. As far back as the 1500s, young indentured servants gave up everything to come to new lands. As these colonies gained autonomy, young people were largely on the front lines of battlefields and the like. The American Revolution began brewing after the French and Indian War. Sybil Ludington was a young woman of only 16 when she grabbed her horse and rode more than twice the distance of Paul Revere to warn militiamen of the approaching British forces. Another young revolutionary, Peter Francisco, was a Portuguese immigrant, patriot, and soldier in the Revolutionary War, famous for both his hulking size and strength, as well as his bravery in the bloody battles of the war. Deborah Sampson was another valiant soldier in the Revolution, who dressed up as a man and used her brother's name, Robert Shirtliff, to enlist in the Patriot forces. Also on the front lines were young fifers and drummers such as 16-year-old William Diamond, who bravely stood against enemies and assisted the war effort with his musical playing. If young people were unable to join the army, they could and often would help by working around the house, especially young women, who cooked, sewed, and made goods for the soldiers of the Revolution. Although young people were barred in many ways from joining political movements and wars directly, they wasted no time in assisting wherever they could. The next major development in American history was the Civil War, erupting in 1861 and continuing for 4 years. This conflict between the North and the South tore families apart, and the extremely emotional and personal nature led many young men to enlist and fight for their beliefs. Although the rule was that soldiers had to be 18 or older to join, many recruiters looked the other way, with young boys eager to join and the pressure of needing more manpower. At least 100,000 soldiers in the war were under 15, and roughly 20% were under 18. Johnny Clem was a famous but not entirely unique case of a child soldier. After running away from home, Johnny repeatedly attempted to enlist in different Union companies until becoming a drummer boy and eventually being paid a salary. On the home front, not unlike the Revolutionary War, young boys and young women worked to provide food, clothing, and other supplies and goods for the soldiers. Some women worked as nurses on the front lines as well. During this period and before, there were many young abolitionists and secessionists alike who campaigned for their respective causes. Later in the American timeline, the Great Depression struck the country and left no person unaffected. One of the most significant developments for young people during this time was the rise of wild boys, or adolescent runaways. Many of these young men left home in an attempt to help their parents. One boy, Jim Mitchell, remarks that he would lighten his parents' burden if he took off. Ultimately, these numbers of young people led to the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps, a New Deal program meant for young men up to 25 years old. It was one of the more popular programs of the time and quite successful in getting these so-called hobos off of the streets. 10 years later, around the time of World War II, more and more social issues were arising. The average age of an American soldier was between 18 and 37, meaning there were plenty of young men fighting for the ideals of liberty. At home, women filled the labor positions left by men and directly contributed to the war efforts. When young Americans weren't fighting or working on the home front, they were organizing and forming their own groups. The Starlight Club, a teenage nightclub, was an interracial group for high school girls and boys that opened in November of 1944. Later came the Co-Rec Council, which incorporated a United Nations-inspired One World mission into its recreational program for young men and women. The fact that these groups were politically based and interracial was quite progressive for its time. The term teenager was rarely used before the 1950s. During the Eisenhower years, young people began to see themselves as a distinct group. Their attempts to forge an identity worried adults, who couldn't quite understand the shift. The 60s were a time of social and political upheaval, largely due to the civil rights movement gaining traction and opposition. The idea of political involvement of young people has never, by any means, been limited to white Americans. While there were white students and white people lending support to the civil rights movement, the strides and the credit belong entirely to the black community and black teenagers who fought for justice. The SNCC, Student Nonviolence Coordination Committee, or SNCC, was a prime example of young people's involvement in politics through the civil rights era. With the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s, the Vietnam War was raging and everyone in America was affected. TV brought the gruesome war to the average American's living room, exposing them to the bloodshed and violence of the conflict. Over half of the American soldiers killed in Vietnam were between 18 and 20 years old. When the draft mandated young men be sent off to fight, many college-age Americans exploded with protest. Indignation towards the war and government led young people across American campuses to protest. In one case at Kent State University on May 4th, 1970, unarmed students protesting the Cambodia campaign were gunned down by the Ohio National Guard. 4 were killed and 9 others wounded. From there, 4 million students nationwide participated in a strike, and the public opinion of the war, especially amongst young Americans, deteriorated even further. In 1971, the 26th Amendment was passed and lowered the voting age to 18. After the Vietnam War, more issues rose to popularity. The second wave of the movement for gender equality came to the forefront of American politics in the post-Vietnam 70s. While many second-wave feminists were older, the movement hardly would have thrived without the younger women and men who supported gender equality. Throughout the next 3 decades, teenagers continued to rise to the forefront of culture. Young people became symbols and influencers of what was deemed cool, and by 2010, social media was dominated by people 24 and under. Facebook, the world's most popular social media, was started by a young American man for fellow college students. MySpace was a site to share thoughts and feelings along with music, all geared toward teenagers and college-age people. Now, Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat are social spaces led by young people, and with this heavy influence comes strong political power. In August of 2014, a young black man was shot and killed by a police officer, sparking the rapidly rising Black Lives Matter movement. A huge number of these advocates were young Americans, and this trend of youth involvement continued to the election of 2016, where many teenagers on the internet voiced support for the candidate Bernie Sanders. On Valentine's Day of 2018, 17 people, including staff and students, were murdered at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, by a gunman. This event sparked outrage across America, especially amongst high schoolers. The resulting movement, led by teenage survivors of the shooting, was called March for Our Lives and involved nationwide school walkouts and marches in protest. Here in Gridley, California, a significant number of students participated in a peaceful, 17-minute-long walkout to honor the victims of the shooting and to raise awareness for the prevention of violence in schools. More than 1 million Americans participated in these protests and the similar march, with the entire movement being orchestrated and led by teenagers. Today, young people are remaining active in politics across the internet and in real life, through researching local politicians and communicating with these influential figures to voice their opinions. The following results are from a study I conducted with young people from 12 to 24. While the majority of the results are from the Butte and Placer County areas, many others voiced in. Even a friend of mine currently in Thailand shared her views. Overall, the results aren't too shocking. Today's youth are growing more and more diverse, along with America, through race, religion, and things like sexuality and gender. There were a number of respondents who either agreed with the current president's policies, were unsure, or found themselves in the middle. Still, the majority of the young people polled disagreed with this administration and aren't simply sitting aside passively. These results show that the majority of young Americans have at least some interest in politics, and most have even participated in some sort of movement or protest themselves. Young people have always had a hand in stirring the winds of change, since the beginning of time, and especially now. Although we have our flaws, we, as a whole generation, have massive voice and power in today's world. If we truly step up to speak and fight for what we believe, there's nothing stopping us from changing the world.